Hello, my name is Jennifer Weaver, and on behalf of Advancing Evidence-Based Practice, we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on Communities That Care. Communities That Care is a Blueprints Promising program that for 20 years has been helping community stakeholders to identify their community's needs and the programs that best meet those needs. Dr. David Hawkins is here with us today, and he is one of the developers of CTC. He is also the founding director of the Social Development Research Group at the University of Washington, and a past president of the Society for Prevention Research. David will provide an overview of CTC and describe how it has been developed, utilized, and evaluated over time. Brian Bumbarger is also here with us today. He is the director of the EPISCenter in Pennsylvania, one of the first states to adopt CTC on a statewide basis. He is also Assistant Director for Knowledge Translation and Dissemination at the Prevention Research Center for the Promotion of Human Development. Brian will discuss the statewide scale-up of CTC in Pennsylvania, where the model has been introduced in over 100 communities. Brian will describe the benefits of a large-scale implementation of CTC, as well as community and systems-level outcomes seen in evaluations in Pennsylvania. We're excited to hear from both of our presenters. Please, if you have any questions, send those via the question box, and please select the option to send to all. Brian and David will answer clarifying questions as we go and discussion-type questions at the end of the webinar. We will now turn the time over to David. Hi, David. How are you?
Hi, Jen. Fine, thanks. How are you?
Good. Okay, we're
Good.
getting this turned over to you.
Do you see it?
Almost. There's always a little delay. There we go.
Great. All ready to roll then?
We are. It looks good.
Great. Thanks, Jen. Thanks all for participating. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk with you about Communities That Care today. And I want to just begin by thanking the organization.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
This is David Hawkins. I'm just going to go back one. I just got an announcement that the broadcast is now starting, so I'm going to begin my presentation of Communities That Care on empowering communities to use prevention science to improve youth behavior and health. I want to start by thanking the organizations that have funded the research that we're going to be talking about today, and especially the states, the 7 states that you see listed here that have collaborated with us on the implementation and testing of Communities That Care that I'll be discussing with you today. I wasn't always a professor at a university. Before that, I was a probation officer working with delinquent youngsters. And as a probation officer, I began to ask myself this question: isn't there something that people should have done to prevent kids from getting to this place where they hate school, they love ripping people off, and I'm supposed to help them change that and turn their lives around? I felt like I was running an ambulance service at the bottom of a cliff, trying to really change things, but every day the juvenile court would be referring more kids to us, to the probation services, and I began to really become interested in prevention. Couldn't we prevent kids from getting to this place in the first place? Shouldn't something have been done before this? When my partner in research and Rick Catalano began to look around and said, what do we know about prevention? We realized that by 1980, a study that had been done by a faculty member here at the University of Washington showed that there had been 9 delinquency prevention experiments in America by 1980. None of them had been shown to be effective at actually preventing delinquency before it happens. We looked at other areas, other fields, and said, who's been successful in prevention? And in the area of cardiovascular disease, we said, here are people in public health who've been successful in prevention. What people who were concerned with heart and lung disease did was they, through the Framingham and other longitudinal studies, identified risk factors for heart and lung disease. And today we all know what they are: a sedentary lifestyle, smoking, a diet high in fat, a family history, we know that those things increase the risk for cardiovascular disease, and we also know that we've had a sea change in lifestyle as a result of understanding those risk factors, and over 40% reduction in deaths due to cardiovascular disease, in part due to understanding that if you want to prevent a problem before it happens, you need to identify the factors that predict that problem and change those factors, what we call risk factors. There have been 34 years of research since then, longitudinal studies done by people like Del Elliott and David Farrington, our own research group here, many others, that have identified predictors of negative developmental outcomes like delinquent behavior, as well as predictors of well-being. And if we just look quickly at this next chart, across the top, what you see are a number of health and behavior problems of adolescents. And down the rows, you see within the community, within the family, within the school, and within the individual and peer group, factors that have been shown in well-controlled longitudinal studies and epidemiological studies to increase the likelihood of these outcomes. If you see a dot at the intersection of a row and a column, that means that risk factor has been shown in 2 or more high-quality studies to predict that outcome. When you don't see a check of the intersection of a row and the column, it means that we don't know for sure if that's a risk factor for that outcome or not. We can't say if you were able to change that risk factor, you would get an improvement in that outcome. But what we can see is that there are a number of risk factors like family management problems, when parents fail to set clear expectations for their kids, when they don't monitor their kids, and when they're excessively severe and inconsistent in discipline, that actually increases risk for every one of these health and behavior problems, both externalizing problems like violence and internalizing problems like depression and anxiety. So these are potential targets for preventive intervention, and yet there are a lot of them. No community can simultaneously probably introduce interventions to address all these risk factors. And so one of the things that we realize is that communities may need to decide which risk factors to prioritize in their prevention efforts. These longitudinal studies have also identified protective factors that, when present, seem to buffer against the development of problem behaviors like delinquency, even in the face of risk exposure. There are 5 keys here to promoting healthy behaviors or non-delinquent behaviors of young people. The first is opportunities for active involvement. When a mom picks up an infant, that's an opportunity for active involvement. When a first grade teacher lets a young person feed the gerbils, that's an opportunity for active involvement. The second key protective component is skills for successful participation. So when a mom picks up an infant, if the infant coos or says, da, 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 that's a skillful performance for an infant. In the first grade, if a young person gets to feed the gerbils and the teacher has taught that young person both food and water is essential for the survival of the gerbil, then that young person is going to be successful because they're going to be skillful in feeding and watering the gerbils. The third characteristic that needs to be present is recognition for skillful performance. When mom picks up the baby and the baby coos and the mom says, "Oh, did you see she cooed to me?" That's recognition. When the teacher says at the end of the week that I've been feeding the gerbils, "Wow, class, did you see that David fed the gerbils and watered the gerbils all week and the gerbils are really happy? Let's give Dave a hand." That is recognition. Opportunity, skills, and recognition in any social unit help a young person feel bonded to that social unit, that is, committed to that group, liking the people in that group. And bonding is important because it provides the motivation to live according to the standards offered by that group. If I'm bonded to school, I like my teacher, and she says you need to do your homework tonight, I'm more likely to do it. If I'm bonded to my family and my mom says, "I don't want you smoking yet, you're too young to smoke, I don't think you should smoke, or don't drink at the party tonight," I'm more likely to follow those instructions, those standards for behavior, and to engage in healthy behavior, because those opportunities, skills, and recognition build bonding, the standards were clear, behavior is more likely to be positive. That social development strategy is the fundamental foundation of communities that care that we'll be talking about today. The other real progress that's happened in the last 34 years since 1980, when this review was done and we didn't really know of any effective delinquency prevention programs is that, as many of you know, there have been many experimental trials of a number of programs both for prevention and early intervention to prevent delinquency that have been tested and shown to be effective, as well as in preventing related other health and behavior problems like substance abuse, teen pregnancy, etc. And the Blueprints programs lists those programs that have been shown in well-controlled trials to have preventive effects. What you're looking at here is just an example of the kinds of programs that across development have been tested and shown to be effective in reducing health and behavior problems across the child and into a child's period and into young adulthood. So today we have many tested and effective prevention programs, and yet when we look around our communities, we find that prevention approaches that don't work or have never been evaluated are more widely used than those shown to be effective. And many of us are aware of programs like DARE or Scared Straight that are quite popular even today, in spite of the fact that they haven't shown to prevent adolescent delinquency or substance use. We think the challenge is to increase the use of tested and effective prevention policies and programs while recognizing that communities are different from one another and need to decide locally what programs they use. Are you all with me still? Did people hear me?
Yes, we can hear you great, and your screen looks great.
Oh, great. Okay, fine. I just wanted to verify and make sure that it was all working well.
And David, can I just take
Yes.
a minute to tell everyone, because somehow it got cut off at the beginning, if you have a question, please send those via the question box and select all, send to all, and that way Brian and David can address questions that are clarifying questions as we go along, and then they'll hold the discussion questions toward the end. Thanks, David.
Okay. So, again, we want communities to use evidence-based programs if they're going to achieve effectiveness. We think that's the most safe way to move ahead. And yet we know that communities are different from each other. People don't like to be told, you have to do this program. This is the one that you have to do. Communities want to decide locally what programs they use. And another reason for this is when you look at risk profiles of different communities, you find that different communities have different risk factors that are most widespread. In one community, it may be easy access for drugs. In another community, it may be kids are not very committed to school, or it may be that law enforcement is not enforcing the rules against young people using alcohol. So we think that we need to think about local community development of prevention strategies to address those risk factors that are most widespread in that community and those protective factors that are most depressed or low in that community. That led us to an hypothesis that says if we could promote local choice and implementation of evidence-based programs that addressed widespread risks in a community, that would produce community-wide effects on youth health and behavior outcomes. And in the late 1980s, early 90s, we began to develop this Communities That Care operating system to try to achieve this goal. Communities That Care is not a program. It is just as on your cell phone or on your computer, you need an operating system to get to the right application. Communities That Care is an operating system that helps communities get to the right prevention applications to meet their needs. It begins with the key leaders of a community deciding that they want to use the advances of prevention science to guide prevention work in their community, and the key leaders, the mayor, police chief, school superintendent, business leaders, etc., of that community appoint or identify an existing coalition or board, the children's partnership in that city, or a prevention coalition that already exists in that city, or if there isn't one, they appoint members to a Communities That Care coalition or board to carry out this Communities That Care process. That coalition includes the diversity of stakeholders in that community who care about youth development. The members of that board then conduct surveys of all the public school students in 6th, 8th, 10th, and 12th grades in the community using the Community Care Use Survey, which helps them identify risk factors that are most prevalent and widespread in that community, affecting the largest number of people, as well as protective factors that are low, as well as youth outcomes, self-reports rates of delinquency, substance use, and other health and behavior problems, as well as success in school. Based on that assessment, they prioritize 2 to 5 risk factors that they want to change in that community, as well as protective factors that they want to strengthen. And they then choose from the Blueprints menu tested and effective programs that have been shown to affect the risk factors they're targeting and the behavioral outcomes that they want to change among young people in their community. Communities that Care helps them go through that prioritization and then selection process, and then plan an action plan for implementing the new programs that they've chosen to fill gaps in existing services in the community and to implement those programs with high fidelity. Every 2 years, the survey in the 6th, 8th, 10th, and 12th grades in the community is repeated so that the community can see if we are in fact achieving progress in reducing the targeted risk factors and changing the behavioral outcomes. Communities that Care goes through 5 phases. If you're interested in learning more about Communities that Care's phases, I'll show you the new Communities that Care website that has a description of what happens in each of these phases, but you hopefully have the general idea of how Communities that Care works. Communities that Care has been installed in communities through a series of 6 trainings. Certified Communities that Care trainers go out to the community to first meet with the key leaders and orient them to Communities that Care and allow them and give them the tools they need to make a decision. Is this the right system for us at this time? Are we ready for this? Is it ready for us? If they say yes, then they appoint that community board, and that board receives a training, a community board orientation. The board then learns how to assess risk protection and outcomes in the community through the surveys as well as archival data, then does a resource assessment to say what's already going on in our community that we want to build on. We don't want to replace good things. We want to fill gaps in existing services that are already effective in our schools and in our community. That's another training. And then they receive a planning training, and finally a training on how to implement the programs they've chosen. So these 6 trainings involve a Communities that Care trainer going to the community 6 different times over the course of about a year. That leads to a process and timeline for CTC. CTC isn't a quick fix that within a year you're going to see outcomes that are changed. It takes 6 to 9 months, almost a year, to do this assessment and planning process. Then by a year, communities are usually implementing new preventive interventions to fill gaps in services. In 2 to 5 years, you will begin to see increases in priority protective factors, decreases in the risk factors that the community is targeted, and in 4 to 10 years, begin to see outcomes that are different in the community as a result of using the Communities that Care process, lower rates of delinquent behavior or drug use, etc. Now, if a community decides to begin with early childhood interventions or even something like nurse-family partnership and even earlier in the infancy of a new baby, then it's going to be 10 years or longer before you would see effects on those preventive interventions on the delinquent behavior of the children whose parents were involved in those kinds of programs. So it may be longer to see effects on delinquency or substance use in adolescence if people choose an early childhood program. That's why we say 4 to 10 years before you see results of the intervention. We've had the opportunity to do a randomized controlled trial of Communities that Care involving 24 incorporated towns across the 7 states that you see highlighted in blue there. We matched these communities in pairs with in-state, matched on demographic as well as crime rates, and then randomly assigned one member from each of those pairs to either the CTC or the control condition. We had funding from the institutes that you saw earlier for a 5-year implementation phase over which we helped communities in the CTC condition install Communities that Care, and a 5-year sustainability phase in which we've been tracking young people in those communities and also young people who leave those communities, and also observing what's going on in the prevention systems in those communities to see if CTC was sustained over the 10 years of this research study. As I mentioned, we've been following a panel of over 4,400 kids since they were in 5th grade. We've been surveying them annually with the exception of the 11th grade through grade 12, and I'll talk to you about some of those results from following that panel. So in the trial, the coalition of stakeholders in the CTC towns received 6 CTC trainings. They collected data on local levels of risk and protection using the survey and archival data from the community, public record data from juvenile court and from schools. They prioritized their risk and protective factors that they wanted to address, and they implemented test and effective prevention policies and programs from the menu provided to them. Now, in this trial, because we only had 5 years to show effects, we asked community coalitions to focus their efforts on choosing preventive interventions that would be operating when children were in the 5th through the 9th grade, in that middle school period when we know a lot of initiation of delinquency and substance use starts. So that was a limited menu for the trial, but Communities That Care's menu and the Blueprints menu obviously goes from before birth all the way through into adulthood. What you're looking at on this chart is the school-based programs, the selective programs for more high-risk kids, and the family-focused programs, also universal programs that were put in place in these communities over the 4 years of intervention after the planning year and the first 5 years of the trial. You can see that a number of school-based, universal school-based programs were put in place in these school districts. I would point out that in the first year, in 2004-2005, the first year of program implementation, only 6 of those communities actually put a school-based curriculum in place, a prevention curriculum in place. And that's because a number of these school districts said, we can't do that. We've got No Child Left Behind that we have to accomplish, and we have to focus on math and reading and language arts. We can't focus on preventing substance use or teaching kids social and emotional skills. But because there was a coalition in those towns really working together with school people and service people and people who've been looking at prevention science and trying to understand all these things, working together, those board members kept saying, you know, can young people really learn math if they're stoned in the math class? Don't we really need to do both academically focused curricula as well as these curricula that will ensure young people have the skills to get along with others in class, to work on group projects, and to not get involved in behaviors that would compromise their success in school and their graduation from school. And what you see is that by the 4th year and the 5th year of the study, all 12 experimental CTC communities were implementing school-based programs in the public schools in those communities. You can see that some interventions for kids thought to be at higher risk by virtue of either academic difficulties would get tutoring. Kids who were thought to be perhaps at risk because they needed an adult mentor might get big brothers and big sisters in these communities. And also the communities often offered family-focused programs to address the risk factors in families that they'd identified. And you can see that the number of programs increased from 27 early on to 38, 39 in the latter years of intervention. There were about 10,000 young people in these 12 communities who were in the 6th, 7th, or 8th grade in the period when we were looking at this. And what you can see when you look at that school-based program, those school-based programs, that in the first year only about 1,400 of those 10,000 kids were exposed to preventive interventions. But by the 4th year of the study and the 3rd year of intervention, over half of those kids were now being exposed to preventive interventions in school. And by the last year of intervention that we were involved with, 5,700 young people, well over half, were being exposed to preventive interventions in the schools. That means that we were saturating those communities with evidence-based preventive interventions that have been tested and shown to be effective. The after-school programs, we expected less kids to be involved because they were more selective programs for kids at higher risk. We were disappointed that the family-focused programs didn't reach as many people as the school programs did. That's a nut we've still got to crack. It's a topic we could talk about later in the meeting. We were really hopeful we'd get larger numbers of families involved. I think the exciting thing is, though, that we are getting saturation in the school-based preventive interventions. So our model suggests that if you do community secure training and technical assistance, it will change the way the structure of prevention services and the services provided in that community, leading to more tested and effective prevention programs, which is what I've just shown you, which we think should lead to positive youth outcomes. So what have we learned about the effects of communities at care in the trial? We started with 4,407 young people in the 5th grade. We've been following them ever since, as I noted. Through grade 12, we were able to successfully interview over 90% of them at every one of these waves. So attrition is not a big threat to our results. We have very good completion of these interviews with young people, these surveys with young people. We began the survey in April of 2003, the study. By the end of the 7th grade, those kids we've been following since 5th grade already were reporting lower exposure to risk factors that have been targeted by the experimental communities when compared to the control communities, and lower rates of delinquency initiation. By the end of the 8th grade, those findings were there, as well as higher levels of protective factors and reductions in initiation and prevalence of alcohol use, cigarette initiation, prevalence of binge drinking, etc. By the end of the 10th grade, 1 year after we stopped supporting the communities in implementing CTC, 1 year later in the panel, we continue to see significant reductions in targeted risk factors reported by community young people, as well as effects on delinquency, violence, alcohol use, and cigarette use. And by the end of the 12th grade, significant reductions in proportion of kids who'd ever started delinquent behavior, violent behavior, alcohol use, or cigarette use. Just to give you an idea of the scope of these findings, in the panel, the kids who were in the CTC communities were 33% less likely to have started smoking cigarettes, 32% less likely to have started drinking, and a quarter less likely, 25% less likely to have started engaging in delinquent behavior when compared to the control panel at that grade, and also significant reductions in current prevalence of these behaviors, alcohol, tobacco use, or alcohol use and delinquent behavior. When we followed those kids up at the end of the 10th grade, we saw continued effects on those outcomes. And at the end of the 12th grade, you can see here that about a third of kids in the CTC communities had never used alcohol by the time they were graduating from high school, compared to less than a quarter of those young people in the control communities. That changes the peer culture of those communities. Now I'm 1 in 3 who said, no, I'm not doing that yet, compared to less than 1 in 4 in the control communities. These are all significant findings that we're looking at. Half the kids in the CTC communities had never smoked by the end of 12th grade, to compare to about 43% in the control communities. And again, a significant reduction of about 2/5 of kids in the CTC communities never engaged in delinquency, compared to about a third of kids in the control communities. So we're seeing that a community change strategy, communities that care, can actually reduce the prevalence and the incidence of health and behavior problems like delinquency and alcohol, tobacco use on a prolonged basis community-wide. One of the questions we had was that benefit worth the cost of communities that care? We calculated the per youth cost of communities that care, all the training, all the programs, all the coordinator, all the work of the coalition, etc. It averages about $556 per child over the 5 years of the implementation phase. How do we get benefits that are monetizable from communities that care? Well, for example, if we have an effect on delinquent behavior, we know that that can reduce criminal justice system costs and victimization costs. And there's also an indirect effect of reducing delinquency, which is kids who don't engage in delinquency are more likely to graduate from high school, which means they'll have more earnings gains as well as less health care costs over their lives. And so we can monetize these benefits using the Washington State Institute for Public Policy methods developed by Steve Oss, and using their software. We've done these analyses which show that the benefits of communities that care, as you go across criminal justice, victimization, earnings, etc., as you put all those benefits together, you see that at the end of 12th grade, the CTC benefit is $4,477. But Steve Oss and the Washington Institute for Public Policy say if the developer of a program is involved in the research study, we're going to cut the effect size in half. And I am a developer of Communities That Care and was the principal investigator on this study. And so we're needing to look over here at the WSIPP adjustments to effect sizes because we're just cutting our effect sizes in half and therefore our benefits in half to compare our benefits to our costs to see is Communities That Care a good investment given the results that it produced. And what you can see down at the bottom of this chart is that for every child involved in Communities That Care, there is a $1,749 net present value. That is, the value of the benefits over the costs of Communities That Care is $1,750 per kid involved in the CTC communities. The benefit cost ratio is over $4 per dollar invested. And the Monte Carlo simulations show that you will get a positive net present value 99% of the time when you do Communities That Care. So there is not very much uncertainty about will you get positive effects when you do Communities That Care. And finally, what we see is that the Communities That Care costs more than it produces benefits over the first 5 years, but starting in the 6th year of a community using Communities That Care, you find that there is a positive cash flow or return on investment starting in the 6th year and continuing on over the life of young people exposed to CTC because their communities use it. So to summarize, net present value, benefit cost ratio, low risk of negative investment return, and those findings, mostly those benefits, mostly come from the fact that CTC has an effect in actually preventing delinquent behavior as well as alcohol use and tobacco use. One final thing I would say here is that we've been able to do what's called mediation analysis. We've been able to say when you get trained in Communities That Care, how does that change the prevention strategy of that community? And we asked 15 key leaders in those communities, in both experimental and control communities, a number of questions to see if they were trying to use evidence-based programming, if they were trying to reduce risk and enhance protection, if they were trying to implement with fidelity, etc., if they were using prevention science to guide their work. What we found is that CTC leads key leaders of a community to be more likely than control community leaders to say we're trying to use those aspects of prevention science. We're trying to reduce risk, we're trying to use evidence-based programs to fill gaps, and we're implementing with effectiveness, with fidelity in order to try to change outcomes for young people in our community. And when key leaders say that, that explains all those reductions in delinquency, substance, and tobacco and alcohol use that we saw at the end of the 8th grade. That is, by changing the system so that community leaders understand the need to use evidence-based programs to address priority risks that are widespread in their community and to do that with fidelity, that is in fact responsible for all the effects that we see on children's outcomes in the Communities That Care trial. So that was the Communities That Care trial, and I'm going to turn it over now to Brian Bumbarger, who has been leading an effort at Penn State University in the EPISCenter, which is made possible and funded by the Pennsylvania Council on Crime and Delinquency to help communities in the state of Pennsylvania use Communities That Care to effectively prevent delinquency and substance abuse problems.
Thank you, David. Brian, if you just want to select in the little pop-up window on your screen to start screen sharing with us.
Is that working, Jen?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks,
We
Jennifer.
still just need to see your screen. Sometimes there's a little delay. Do you see a little pop-up window?
Yeah, and I clicked on that. You're not seeing my screen yet?
Not yet.
Do I need to do anything to get rid of my screen? Would that help?
Only if you have a message up on your screen, but I don't think you do. Do you?
No, let me just get rid of this. This says organizer Jennifer Weaver and presenter Brian Bumbarger.
Okay, so Brian, it should be showing your screen. I don't know if I'm just buried under so much on mine. David, do you see Brian's screen?
No, I just see Communities that Care, Organizer, so on. I don't see Brian's slides yet.
Okay, let me try changing the presenter again. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to change it back to you, David, and
Okay.
then we're going to try changing it to Brian again, because I think it just kind of disappeared on Brian when he selected it without making the change.
Do you want me to say show my screen or not?
Let's see. Nope, I can switch it back to Brian now. So Brian, you should get that little message box again.
How about now?
Not yet.
I got the message box and I clicked on it.
Okay. Well, you know what? How about this? David, would you like to show us that website?
Okay, let me.
Let's do that, and then we'll share screens with Brian again after that.
Hold on just a second. I need to reopen
Sure.
my things here. Okay, so should I make this? Are you ready to see it? Okay, show my screen.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Can you see the screen now?
Yes. We can see your last one of your
Okay.
CTC slides.
All right. Good. All right. Hopefully we'll get to hear from Brian. He's got a great presentation. I want to see it and hear it because I heard it yesterday. But in the interim, let me just tell you what we've been working on in the last year. As I mentioned earlier, the CTC trainings delivered live through 6 visits to each CTC community by a certified trainer coming back after they've learned how to do the assessment. Then they do the assessment. They then learn how to do the resource assessment, and then they do the resource assessment. The trainer comes back and works with them on the action plan, and then they develop their action plan, and then the trainer comes back and works with them on their implementation planning. It works. But it's very labor intensive. It's expensive because the person has to keep coming back 6 different times, sometimes needs to do 2-day trainings, which means people have to be out of their offices while they're in the training event for a couple of days. And it also means that if, as a new mayor is elected, or a new superintendent of schools comes on, or new teachers or new members of the coalition become involved, there needs to be some way to train those people, and if the trainer has to come back, that's very costly. Often people in the local community say, well, we'll kind of give you an orientation, and training kind of gets watered down sometimes. And so this makes really scaling CTC or spreading it to a large number of communities difficult. We've had the opportunity with funding from the National Institute on Drug Abuse to try to address this problem by developing what a number of communities have asked us for, which is, could you provide the Communities that Care training online, streamed via the web, so that a local facilitator, a person from our community, could actually facilitate the CTC training without having to send a live trainer out to us. And we've developed a training that does just that. It's a series of CTC workshops that are locally facilitated by a local facilitator who receives 3 days of training in how to facilitate the CTC process, and then facilitates it locally with backup from our group or a technical assistance provider like Brian's EPISCenter in Pennsylvania to ensure quality and successful implementation of Communities Care. If you're interested in learning more about the web-based, web-stream version of Communities that Care training, if you go to this website, www.communitiesthatcare.net, you can learn more about it. And I'm going to actually take you there now so that you can see what the website is like. You can see across the top there's a lot of information about Communities that Care. If you're interested in the research on Communities that Care, just click on Research and Results, and as you scroll down that page, you'll find that there are findings from the studies, as well as research briefs that summarize the studies, as well as the actual research articles that actually present all the results of the studies of communities that care that have been done. So this is a very hopefully helpful and worthwhile website that you can check out. And you can also notice that there are videos on this website that will teach you what is CTC about, give you more information about it so that you can learn about communities that care. I'm going to show you what happens if you're a CTC community and you're moving forward in the communities that care process using this new electronic communities that care, or what we call ECTC system. If you're a facilitator, a local facilitator in a CTC community, you click on for facilitators and you begin to be able to scroll down, learn about your role as a facilitator, and then what you need to lead each of the web workshops that are in communities that care. And you see in orange the phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, phase 5 workshops. I know that many people today are interested in the whole question of implementation and implementation fidelity. So I'm going to skip through the process and just show you in phase 5. If you go to phase 5 and you click on phase 5 and you're a facilitator, you learn how to lead the workshops in phase 5. How to organize for phase 5. There's a facilitator's guide. There are documents that you can print out for your workshops. And then there are the actual web presentations that you lead people through by clicking on these sessions. So for example, there's workshops on funding, on systems change, on monitoring program implementation and outcomes, etc. If we go down, and I would just say that the videos that we've produced are 2 to 5 minutes in length. They're embedded in an adult learning instructional model in which the videos provide 3 kinds of information. One is foundation information, or what we call the big picture. What is prevention science? What are risk factors? What are the risk factors that are important, etc. There are also videos that are what are called testimonial videos, videos that explain the experiences, people from communities that have been doing communities of care, talking about their experiences themselves. And then there are also what are called instructional videos, and I'll just give you an example of kind of what that looks like. We are moving into monitoring program implementation outcomes in Module 2, and the facilitator would be leading this. This comes up on the screen for everyone to see in the workshop. And there's something on the value of fidelity, and then ensuring program results, etc. So let's see if I can get this in the right place. Oh dear, what have I done? Let me just jump to this place then. So you can see, here's an example then in that workshop of a little snippet of an instructional workshop, of an instructional video that's part of that workshop.
Full implementation of the program. The facilitator or presenter delivering the program.
David, we just need the volume up on her a little, please.
Let's walk through a sample checklist to find out how to use them. This section helps to measure dosage by documenting how often and when the program is offered. At the top of the checklist, there's a place to record the session location, the name of the facilitator or presenter, time, and date. Next, you'll find a list of specific content to be covered in a particular session of the program. This section measures adherence. The presenter checks off the list to note each of the elements of the content that he or she actually delivered during the session. Next, there are questions about what percentage of session time was devoted to different teaching techniques, those found effective when the program was tested. This section measures high-quality delivery. It's used to evaluate if the presenter employed the program's tested and effective teaching techniques. These include lecture, demonstration, practice, or discussion. Then, the presenter uses the checklist to rate the level of attendee responsiveness. This measures participant involvement. At the end of the checklist, there's a space for making other comments about the session. These comments might note the reasons why required content was not delivered, observations about a group dynamic, and stories about what happened during the session. These checklists are highly valuable tools for monitoring the delivery of your programs. I have to tell you that some program implementers are not initially convinced of the value of completing these checklists. However, once they adopt this practice, they tell me that checklists really help them make sure they've covered all the essential content. They also use checklists for that quick pat on the back for a job well done. And the CTC board can use checklist data to recognize and celebrate high-quality delivery.
Hopefully that was helpful to people to see an example of an instructional video. The other thing that I would just say is that we found that it's very interesting and useful to people to hear about what have people seen and in their own communities as they begin to use this communities that care process. And I think the last thing I might do is just show you this video is a martial arts teacher in a community in Camden, Maine. It's a CTC community who got involved in the programs and in leading some classes in his community. If I can get this to come back here for me. And we'll just hear what he has to say about communities that care in his communities and using the social development strategy in his community in his martial arts program. I guess we may not see that. Let's see. Hold on.
So in a nutshell, the social development strategy tells us that if we provide...
We just need her volume a little higher. Thank you.
Saying, wow, we've noticed such a change in Sally or Billy and how they're more vocal in class, how they're more helpful to their students, how they show more empathy and they're able to help others that are maybe being picked on or having hard situations. So, for me, that social development strategy is huge. It helps to make sure that I know the program we're providing is actually going to lead the kids to not only be healthy but also be successful as they get that black belt and they become that young adult.
Okay, that's kind of it for me. Hopefully people can see that there is now a technology-based way in which communities can get access to community secure training. And if you go to that communitysecure.net website, you can get in touch with us if you have questions or are interested in learning more about eCTC and the web-streamed workshops and the implementation support system.
Thank you so much, David. We will try to switch over to Brian and see if his screen sharing is working. However, if it's not, we do have a few questions, and I should mention that we've gotten some great feedback for you, especially that the web-based tools are wonderful and very helpful for the attendees who are viewing the webinar today. So thank you for that, David.
Thank you.
So we'll switch over to Brian. Yay, that looks good. We're seeing something. Are you there, Brian?
I am.
Great.
How about now?
Yay!
Yep,
I
we
see
see
it
you
too.
and your puppy.
All right. Okay, success, victory. Okay, well, thanks, Jen, and thanks, David, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll try to maybe rush through this a little bit to try to make up for some lost time. Like David, I also started out in juvenile probation, and this is my dog Maggie, who is currently on probation because she ate my socks last night. As David mentioned, I'm going to be describing an unusual and long-standing effort in Pennsylvania to take the communities that care model to scale. In Pennsylvania, the Communities That Care model of community mobilization and data-driven strategic prevention planning is really seen as a critical precursor to the adoption and implementation of evidence-based programs and practices. The initiative in Pennsylvania to scale up both Communities That Care and evidence-based programs, primarily the Blueprint programs, has been going on for nearly 2 decades. So there are a lot of folks to acknowledge, both academics and state policymakers. But in particular, I want to recognize the folks at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention at the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency. Their commitment and leadership from PCCD has really made Pennsylvania a leader in evidence-based delinquency prevention. Back in 1994, Pennsylvania collaborated with the state of Colorado, the Justice Department, and the Federal Centers for Disease Control to fund the Center for the Study of Prevention and Violence at Colorado to conduct a review that led to the development of the original list of blueprints for violence prevention. Around the same time here at the Prevention Research Center at Penn State, we conducted a comprehensive review at the request of the federal government to identify programs with empirical evidence of effectiveness in preventing mental disorders in children. Since then, many other lists have emerged to guide policymakers and practitioners in the adoption of evidence-based practices. And there are now a number of searchable online registries to help practitioners navigate the sometimes confusing world of evidence-based strategies. The challenge, though, is getting beyond these lists and online registries and to really moving the needle on key indicators of public health and public safety, especially at the population level. So getting beyond just focusing on kids in systems and really focusing on improving the population level of public health in whole communities. One of the biggest challenges is for communities to know which of these evidence-based programs is the right tool for the job. The process of matching the most effective interventions with the specific needs of a given community is a critically important process that just isn't given sufficient attention in the current policy and practice landscape. What you see there in the picture is, it's called a wet saw, and I learned about this at the local Home Depot store. A wet saw is acknowledged by probably 99 out of 100 general contractors as the most supported and recommended tool for cutting ceramic tile. But as my wife pointed out to me, you can't use a wet saw to cut Jell-O. So the issue here is making sure that not just knowing what's a good evidence-based tool or program, but knowing how to apply it and where and under what conditions. We can think about the typical community and how they go about trying to improve outcomes for kids and families, and we see a common set of issues and challenges. And these are really the very issues that Communities That Care addresses head on. Communities That Care is really specifically targeted to the question of why don't communities see greater success in prevention and the adoption of evidence-based programs. In Pennsylvania, we're really focused on bridging the gap between science and practice through this clearly articulated logic model, creating sustained community-wide public health impact through effective community coalitions using proven effective programs targeted at strategically identified risk and protective factors. Now, the policy agenda of promoting the greater use of evidence-based programs is quite common now, as is the focus on fidelity and sustainability. What's really missing from the conversation, though, is the foundation that CTC establishes that will help this evidence-based programs agenda achieve its promise. Communities That Care started as a statewide initiative back in 1994, and since then there have been over 120 communities across the Commonwealth that have been trained in this Communities That Care model. There are about 65 currently functioning CTC communities in Pennsylvania, and as a result of that scale, Pennsylvania has developed through the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency support a system of assessment and dedicated technical assistance to improve coalition functioning, because we've recognized that one of the most challenging aspects of this community data-driven strategic prevention planning process is maintaining healthy, well-functioning community coalitions. And any of you who have participated in a local community coalition, I'm sure recognize how challenging it is to maintain a coalition as a healthy, well-functioning organization. David described one of the important outcomes in the Community Youth Development Study was the increase in the number of EBPs adopted, and we've been quite successful in Pennsylvania in increasing the adoption of many different blueprint programs across the whole menu of diverse evidence-based programs. But it's important to remember that the goal is improved outcomes, measurable at the population level. Increasing the use of evidence-based programs is simply a potential means to that end. So as I mentioned, CTC in Pennsylvania is seen as a mechanism for increasing the careful selection and adoption of evidence-based programs to address the specific needs of each community. That might even mean that a community does a thorough needs assessment, a thorough diagnosis, and prioritizes an underlying prevalent risk factor for which there is no blueprint or evidence-based program. And that's okay, because the community will still be better off because it has carefully assessed its need and mobilized practitioners and providers in the community to work collectively to address priorities. That community, through Communities That Care, has developed the capacity for problem solving and collective impact. I mentioned that about 120 communities in Pennsylvania have been trained in the CTC model since the mid-90s, and currently there are about 65 functioning coalitions. 65 functioning coalitions across one state is a scale of CTC that I don't believe exists in any other state or country. And like anything, scale creates challenges like maintaining good fidelity to the process and keeping coalitions trained and on task in the face of member turnover and changing priorities. But this scale in Pennsylvania has also afforded us the opportunity to do things like develop mentor coalitions and develop learning communities, to form regional coalitions of coalitions, and to establish in-state training and technical assistance capacity. One of the critically important aspects of Pennsylvania's CTC infrastructure has been the development of the Pennsylvania Youth Survey, or PAYS. Through a recent collaboration between the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency and the Pennsylvania Departments of Education and Drug and Alcohol Programs, the Pennsylvania Youth Survey is now available at no cost to any school district or community in Pennsylvania. As a result, last year we had about 3/4 of Pennsylvania's 500 public school districts participating in this semi-annual data collection to assess risk and protective factors across the Commonwealth and in individual communities. This is going to aid in doing data-driven strategic planning at both the community level and at the state level. Beginning in 2008, the PCCD and the Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare collectively funded and created the EPISCenter, the Evidence-Based Prevention and Intervention Support Center, as a state-level intermediary organization to support the statewide scale-up of both CTC and Blueprint programs. Here you see just an example from our website of the resources we've developed to assist communities in implementing CTC with quality and fidelity. And I encourage you to get on our website, www.epicenter.org, and just explore around and feel free to make use of some of the resources that are on there. As I mentioned, about half of the communities trained in CTC since 1996 are no longer functioning. We've learned that maintaining healthy, well-functioning community coalitions is challenging, and it requires ongoing proactive technical assistance. Part of our technical assistance in Pennsylvania includes an annual anonymous survey of coalition functioning. This web-based survey is completed by coalition members across the state to create a profile of the organizational health of the coalition in that community, which then serves as a catalyst for strategic planning and informs our technical assistance provided to that particular coalition. In addition to the Community Youth Development Study that David described, the randomized trial that David described, we've also done 2 very large quasi-experimental studies here in Pennsylvania to assess the impact of Communities That Care here. The first study was a cross-sectional study involving nearly 100,000 youth in CTC and non-CTC communities across Pennsylvania. What we found in that cross-sectional study was that youth in the CTC communities reported lower rates of risk factors, lower prevalence of substance use and delinquency than youth in similar non-CTC communities in Pennsylvania. In fact, the outcomes were 7 times as many as we would expect by chance alone. And when we drilled down and looked at CTC communities that were not only using that strategic prevention planning process, but were also implementing blueprint programs, these communities showed better outcomes that were on twice as many risk and protective factors and behaviors. In other words, 14 times as many positive effects as we would expect by chance alone. In addition, we followed up with a 5-year longitudinal study that looked at 400 classrooms of kids in Pennsylvania and followed them across a 5-year developmental period from 6th grade to 8th grade to 10th grade to 12th grade. And what we found was that the kids that lived in communities that were using this combination of communities that care, strategic prevention planning, and mobilization, combined with the implementation of blueprint programs, those kids in CTC communities had about 11% lower prevalence rate of delinquency, about 11% lower self-reported negative peer influence. They had 16% higher self-reported school engagement, and they had 33% better academic achievement. So in addition to, although this was really implemented in Pennsylvania as a delinquency prevention initiative, we were pleased to see that the effect was also spilling over into academic and school engagement and academic achievement. Beyond those student outcomes, we've also found that being engaged in the communities that care process means that communities are more likely to mobilize the community and support prevention. The communities, CTC communities, are more likely to promote the use of evidence-based strategies, and they're more likely to assist in evaluating the local impact of these programs in their communities. We've also found that when evidence-based programs are implemented in CTC communities, providers are less likely to make adaptations and more likely to promote fidelity to the program model because the providers of the evidence-based program are responsible for reporting out to this larger community coalition. And finally, we found that evidence-based programs implemented in CTC communities are more likely to sustain 2 or more years beyond the time that the original evidence-based program grant seed funding ended. So collectively then, this means that communities that care in Pennsylvania has resulted in better support for evidence-based practices, better implementation quality and fidelity, and better likelihood of sustainability, and ultimately better outcomes for youth. Now, this exciting partnership with PCCD has given us the opportunity to study the role and functioning of community coalitions for nearly 2 decades, and we've published over 60 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on all aspects of this work. And I also want to point out 2 recent articles that we've published that describe in much greater detail than I can cover here in this short time on the webinar, Pennsylvania's CTC and Blueprints initiative. So I encourage you to look at those 2 articles to learn in more detail what we've done here in Pennsylvania. And finally, I want to just mention this really helpful resource from the Society for Prevention Research on data-driven strategic prevention planning using community monitoring systems like Pennsylvania Youth Survey. And then I'll leave you with this quote from Alice in Wonderland that speaks to the importance of CTC as a foundation to drive the selection and implementation of evidence-based programs that may lead to population-level public health and public safety impact.
Thank you, David. We're going to forego our poll at the end. We had a large number of attendees today, and they've pretty much all stayed on throughout our whole webinar, and so we're going to assume that all those poll questions would have been answered in the affirmative. We have a couple questions we'd like to address. Brian and David, I both have you unmuted, so either of you can answer. One question is, let's see, Dorian would like to know, how narrowly does a community have to be defined for CTC to be effective? So, what about communities that have like a great deal of geographic and economic diversity, or large counties, for example?
We'd like to see, what we've seen is that if a town is less than 1,500 people, it may be too small to really have benefits that outweigh the cost because of the fixed cost of CTC involving a coalition coordinator. However, once you start getting larger than that, then we think that you can serve a community up to 75,000, maybe even 90,000 people with a single CTC initiative. However, in large cities where there may be 500,000 people, we think it's important to think in those contexts about meaningful neighborhoods and service delivery subsystems within the large city so that planning can be done at what we consider to be a neighborhood level, which would be between 50 and 90,000 people in that unit. So there are cities that have done communities of care where they've done several neighborhoods using communities of care, or even focused on 2 or 3 specific neighborhoods. A communities of care initiative that's going on here in Seattle, which has a population of about 500,000, is focusing on the Central District in Southeast Seattle, which is less than 100,000 people as a portion of the city. With regard to large rural counties, I think maybe Brian could answer that better because I know there are some big counties in Pennsylvania that are involved with CTC.
Right. So I think there are 2 answers to that question. One is to think about it from a sort of theoretical perspective. Theoretically, what we're trying to do by the risk and resource assessment in CTC is develop this profile that will allow the community, however the community is defined, to establish some priorities that will affect programming and services in that community. So theoretically, what you want to think about is, what is the definition of community or catchment area that most likely represents a sort of homogeneous risk profile? But the practical concern sometimes is that you might have a neighborhood that you would think has a pretty distinct risk profile, but the neighborhood is so small or is part of a much larger school district that just makes it unfortunately impractical to collect data that's specific to that particular neighborhood. So you really have to sort of balance the theoretical, what are we trying to accomplish here, with the practical, well, what data do we have access to? And what it might mean is that you collect data on a larger catchment area because that's the data, that's all the further that the data you have available is broken down. But then you follow up with, for instance, some local focus groups to have a discussion with the people that live in that neighborhood or community to talk about how to interpret that data that's available in the context of that particular neighborhood.
And how about, how do you see this fitting in with the Strengthening Families implementation? That's a question from Ruth.
Brian, you want to talk about that in Pennsylvania where you have the Strengthening Families initiative? Is that...
Sure. Well, I mean, we have a, I assume that the question is related to the Strengthening Families program for youth 10 to 14. Which is one of the blueprint programs that we're implementing on a large scale here in Pennsylvania. And I think we've seen some very practical benefits to implementing the SFP program in communities in Pennsylvania where there is a well-functioning community coalition. One of the biggest challenges with the Strengthening Families SFP 10 to 14 program, because it's a universal family-focused program, one of the biggest challenges is recruiting families and getting those families to come and attend the sessions. Once they come, once they've attended 1 or 2 sessions, we find they really like it and they keep coming back. But just getting them there for the first time is often challenging, as it is with any universal family-focused prevention program. So having a community coalition in place, a CTC coalition in place that represents lots and lots of different diverse stakeholders, we found it really does help to sort of spread the work of trying to recruit families into the program and to really getting that message out across the community and thinking creatively about ways to get the message out and recruit families in that community. That's just one example.
Okay, we've got two more questions, so tell me if you want to squeeze them in. One is from Anna. She wants to know, are there any community-based interventions that can be implemented once the assessments have been completed? And the other is a question about CTC's experiences with other blueprints programs like MTFC, FFT, and MST.
Let's start with the second question first. MST, FFT, all those programs are included on the menu, on the blueprints menu, and have always been included on the communities of care menu of evidence-based preventive interventions. So there are, in communities, want people to look at both widespread risk factors and also look at interventions that may be needed as indicated preventive interventions for children who are already beginning to enter the criminal justice or juvenile justice or child welfare systems. And so we think that it's important to look at a strategy for prevention that includes both the universal preventive and selective preventive interventions, as well as the indicated preventive interventions for kids who are already starting to engage in these kinds of problem behaviors. So that combination of universal, selective, and indicated preventive interventions is something that we really encourage people in the CTC Coalition to think about, so that they're thinking about preventing kids from getting involved, both the general population as well as those kids who are at high risk, and also, now that we know that we have programs like MST, FFT, etc., that we can, in fact, encourage the juvenile justice system and the child welfare system to implement those programs to reduce penetration of young people further into those systems as a preventive or early interventive strategy. So they're very much part of what Communities of Care Coalition, Communities of Care community will be thinking about and including in their overall strategy. The first question again was, oh, are there any community-wide preventive interventions? Absolutely. Some of the things that communities decide to do, if availability of alcohol is a major risk factor, or if they think that there's not enough enforcement of the laws regarding alcohol use, or if they think that it's too cheap to buy alcohol in that community, there are a number of what are called policy or environmental strategies that have been tested and shown to be effective, that are policy changes that a community can make regarding availability or how near outlets are to schools, even in some instances able to increase a millage rate or a taxation rate on certain behaviors or certain products in order to increase their or decrease their availability, if you will, because we know that price is a determinant of availability to young people, and also that can in fact communicate clear norms or standards for behavior in the community. So there are many community-wide policies or interventions that are potentially implemented as part of the communities of care system, depending on what the profile of risk and protection identifies as priority risk factors.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you both, Brian and David, for being here. We had such a great attendance today with all of our attendees being very attentive. I don't know if many of you know that we can see whether or not you're being attentive during these webinars, and you guys did great. Also, just so that everyone knows, we'll be at Blueprints on the 3rd Friday next month, and we hope to see you there. So we'll be in touch soon as to when our next webinar is. Have a great weekend, and thanks for being with us today. And again, as mentioned before, you can find these recorded webinars on our website, advancingebp.org. So if you'd like to share those with your colleagues or review something that you saw here, please visit our website, and this will be up in the next few weeks. Thanks so much. Bye.